Sup, y'all? I am your host, Taylor Onion, and this is Hang Time. We are back this week with Dr. Janelle Wells, an associate professor in the Vinnick Sport and Entertainment Management program at the University of South Florida and co-founder of Wells Quest. Dr. Wells, let's get some hang time. Welcome.
Absolutely. First and foremost, thank you, Dr. Onion. Excited to be here and thank you for the opportunity to be here to share and learn from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the ways I was going to get to this a little bit later, but one of the ways we know each other is, of course, you're on my dissertation committee. We have also found out, I feel like the volleyball connections, the athletics connections, there's so many crossovers in our paths. But you started as a volleyball student athlete, transitioned into coaching before you made your jump to academia. What role have sports played in kind of shaping your identity in all the things that you do?
It's a very a deep question. And I'd say it's when weaved throughout my entire life. I always love when I do intros, I love to say hashtag more than an athlete because I've said sport has been a tool. Like really since I was 4 years old, I started playing baseball because at that time there wasn't softball around for
Sure.
women opportunities. But it was a tool for me. But it also, when I say weave into everything I do, yes, I've learned skills, collaboration, time management, priority management, discipline. It's allowed me not only to go to school and have formal education paid for at the undergrad, graduate level, and the doctorate level. It's also been a tool that's allowed me to travel the world with my graduate students. This past April, I was just in London and Stockholm, exposing them to the global world of sports. It's also been a tool to allow me to do research. I know some of the things that we'll talk about here about leadership development in this space or equity, gender equity specifically. It's also a tool that allows me to bond with my three kids.
Yeah.
I can still beat, well, there's one I might not be able to beat anymore, the oldest, in a game of horse. Yes, my oldest is 14, so he's very, very skilled by now, but it allows me to bond with them and it allows me to bond even with my partner. My partner works, my husband works in collegiate athletics as an administrator. And so there's dynamic conversations, and not just him, my sister works in this space. So there's just been throughout my life. I just like to say it's a tool for
Mm.
me that I continue to use, I continue to sharpen. And now we're seeing mainstream, even at the investment, particularly in women's sports. And so you're seeing it's all around us. It's a part of our society.
Yeah, I'm loving what's happening, and we'll get obviously to that in some of our research and equity questions. But what led you to want to make that move? So from coaching to pursue the PhD, I guess I don't even actually know at what point you decided to pursue the PhD and then make that transition to academia. How did that come to be?
Yeah, nothing has been linear that I've ever done. I'll say that when I was 27 years old, I essentially was working 3 full-time jobs, before people had multiple revenue streams, right? At that time, it's because I was a collegiate coach, but I was a part-time collegiate coach.
Mm,
But then I was also working for government defense contracts. And because of that skill set, then I also had put in, which I thought went to a black hole, I put in to be an adjunct professor at
mm,
Butler. So I'm 27 years old. I have 3 jobs. And at the end of the day, I always love doing my lesson plan. I always love talking to my students and student athletes on volleyball court about the court of life. Okay, what are we doing outside of here? What are you looking forward to? What's going to be your internship this summer? Where are you going to go for the job? You're graduating next year. What's this going to look like? And so I would always do that and make the connection. And so I was able to, at that time, I realized, I'm like, what do I want to do? If I had the choice to pick what I really want to do full time, listen, I know getting into education, I was like, I might not make all this amount of money, but I'll have ownership of my time,
yeah.
right? I'll be able, my impact, how great it'll be felt, and the waves and those tentacles or the tree branches that will spread, if I go back and get my doctorate and I can do this. And so I did. And so at 28 years old, I went back to get my doctorate and I loved because I was able to really apply it. Yes,
Mm.
we have these theories. And the books might sound great, and then you're like, wait a second. The practicalities and practice does this work? And so I've always been able to do that or to find that point and that connection point. And so that's what allowed me to even start Wells Quest as well. But that's what really was the impetus to me pursuing a PhD.
As you just were talking about that, I'm thinking about all of the fields in which research and practice go hand in hand with actually working in the field. Athletics is maybe one of the only spaces where that's not the case. Most of the researchers are still in the higher education area and not necessarily actively practicing. And most of the folks who are actively practicing are not spending time keeping up on research because it's sports and it's not you're not, a medical doctor or something where you have to keep up on research to kind of sharpen your craft, even though you should in sports. What thoughts, I guess, do you have in that space? I know some of the work that you do with Wells Quest and beyond is trying to bridge that gap. So what are your perspectives on that?
Yeah, I love being a bridge builder, and I'll say that, and I even consider myself like this pracademic. And so it was great. And really having this opportunity afforded to me was having the opportunity at University of South Florida because our partnership with the Vinnick Sport Entertainment program, but also Vinnick Sports Group, which is the umbrella company of the Tampa Bay Lightning. So each of our faculty work with one of the departments
Mm,
because we don't want to be just like, all right, teaching this in class and be so disconnected to what our students are actually doing in the workplace. So, for instance, I specifically work with the people ops. That's what they term their HR department. One of my faculty members works a lot with their analytics department. One works a lot with their sales department because he studies consumer behavior. And so our students even are working 3 days a week and then taking classes to it. What this has allowed me to do, like, yes, in theory, we can see what is happening. We can actually study, we can observe, we do research projects with them, we do training programs with them. And so it really it's made me stay abreast of, okay, what's the latest in the literature, but then what's
mm,
actually working as well in practice. And that came to fruition really from Dr. Sutton, making sure that this program was designed this way
mm.
to make sure our students were best prepared, but then also to make for sure that those that are preparing the students are best prepared as well.
Yeah, a little bit ahead of its time. I think more programs are moving into this experiential place, but the
Mhm.
Vinnick program, you guys have been doing that for a long, long time.
Yeah, 12 years now. Yeah, 2012 graduating class in 2014. Yeah.
Yeah, gosh, that's pretty crazy. Oh, and I mentioned earlier that you were a part of my dissertation committee. I worked at the University of South Florida, of course, and finished my PhD from there. It was important to me to have your expertise as my outside faculty member on that dissertation committee because of your work and the research that you've done focused on women's sports, all the publications you've got in that space as well. What are some of the most compelling insights from your gender-based research as it pertains to sports?
Yeah. And I love the opportunity of having served because that was one thing when I left Florida State because we don't have a doctorate program per se at
Mm,
USF. And so being able to serve on outside committees always fills my cup. I love to see what's happening. How are we using or leveraging even history, to make even better strides and pave new pathways. So thanks for that opportunity, even to
yeah,
serve.
thank you.
Yes. Some of the most compelling insights. One I would definitely say would be Eagly's work in the psychology space of the gender bind. Some will say, hey, it's leadership stereotypes versus gender stereotypes. And so just to give you a little bit of bring it to life, like historically, women have expected, they'll say communal and agenic, but what are those traits? Women have been expected, our gender stereotype is that we should be nurturing. Right? We should be assistants. We should be very communal in our service, right? How we show up. That's essentially expected of us. Where men typically, and yes, I'm using it on a binary because that's how the history and the research has been done, they're expected to be assertive, decisive, decision makers. And which one of those stereotypes aligns more with what's expected of a leader? Right? The male typical prototypicals. And so there's been a conflict, right? When a woman does exhibit those leadership styles, right? She's out of contrast and how she's supposed to be expected to behave as a woman. And so she's evaluated very different, and we do this unconsciously.
Mm,
And so Eagly's work was really brought this to the surface, but then you can see it, and then that I would say it's even magnified when we're in a male prevalent industry such as sport, right? That still is. We have growth opportunities and we're moving the needle, but the majority, if you look at all the main leaders that are in these upper echelon positions, right? And so that has been the biggest one. And just bringing that to people's attention, because, and you've heard terms like, oh, she's bossy, she's bitchy. No, she's just direct. She's
yep.
straightforward. But you wouldn't use those same terms, to describe the male and the characteristics of a male. And so that duality that we constantly have to be aware of. I think of the monologue in the movie Barbie,
Yeah,
right? That really spoke to me because they're like, oh, am I too soft? But I can't be too hard. And it is alive and well. And there's research to back that up. That wasn't just for media and for entertainment. There's
right.
research to that.
Yeah. Well, and there's so many different intersections too, right? Because it's not just women versus men, as you mentioned. That's the binary because that's the way the research is. But there is also race and sexual orientation that builds into that. And are you a mother? Are you not a mother? And how do these things play? All of these different aspects and intersectionalities that play into that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so many things. What progress have you seen, if any, hopefully some, in the last, decade related to research on gender equity in sports, whether it's in leadership or whether it's just in, organizational practice, whatever it looks like? What's some of the progress you've seen?
The progress. The biggest progress, because I will say we still have this pyramid that we're facing. Yes, and women right now are coming out being highly educated, right? So we're entering the workforce at numbers that are higher than ever been seen. There's still this pyramid that exists. And I say that pyramid because as we move up this so-called ladder, right, we'll move a lot into middle management positions, but we're
Mm,
still getting stuck there. And why is that? And not just why is that, like, how are the systems built for that? And you say the intersectionality, I don't know. Is it because of a moment? Is it because I made a choice for a family choice? We still don't know that, but we have seen more into this middle management, but still not these upper echelons. And so progress, but still stagnant at the top, where decision making usually happens. Now, middle management is getting more of that, but if we look at what happened during COVID, because it's like we were on this progress, and then when COVID happened, a lot of that middle management was eliminated, right? And then who was staying home to take care of the kids, right? Or who was making that decision, right? Whether for the family, it might have been. But now it's like, okay, are we coming back? We're 5 years out now, but where are we? But now, when sometimes people get the taste of work remote, if something's not meeting and I like to say work life design that I want to
mhm,
design for my family, then I'm not going to go to it. So maybe I chose a position that pays less, but allows me to be completely remote, right? Because that's better for my family.
right.
And so while progress, there's still a lot of room to go. One other research that I want to share, and it's not mine directly, but I use it a lot, and I make sure I weave it into my teaching, is this idea about Matt Katz at a UMass, and then Dr. Hinman and Dr. Walker. They were at UMass at the same time. Was about these isolated networks. So our
Mm,
social networks, and really important. And I even say this as I'm a part of WISE, Women in Sports and Events, we can't just, while we've grown and we're at the masses, but where are we at the masses at? Again, I said that entry level and that mid, we
yep.
need to have access points, okay, that are at the upper echelons, the executives, the suites. But right now there's only sprinkles, particularly of women. And all of us naturally, we walk in the room and I might more likely go up to speak to you than to a male, but we
Mhm,
have to. Right? And we have to have access points to them because if not, we're on this island. And
yep.
that means we don't have connection to what they call high powered resources. But the resources could be information, even being able to say, Taylor, this job's coming open, or this new project that's going to get you seen. And so we have to be connected to someone, of that decision maker, an executive. And so I challenge all of us, like, ask them to coffee. Ask them to learn about a project that they're working on. Tell them what your goals are and your aspirations so that you are connected to those higher powered resources. And so I know that's something I would say, but it's going to take time. So we need the longitudinal studies to show us what these access points and how that has helped.
I think we're just starting to see tip of the iceberg stuff with that. That research was one of the most eye-opening for me. I included that in my literature review. It helped to shape, obviously, my dissertation work as well. And I think the biggest thing, that I focused on senior woman administrators and their self-perception of power, but the biggest thing was, yes, there's these great organizations like WISE, like Women Leaders in Sports, like all of, the Women's Sports Foundation. There's all these great organizations that are doing such wonderful, impactful, transformational work for women who are in sports. And I think the space where I've seen it in Women Leaders in Sports. I'm still a relative newbie to WISE, and I just don't know enough about the Women's Sports Foundation to know if they're leaning into it in the same way. This idea of a male champion. How do we, yes, we're putting on an educational program or a professional development event for women, but we're going to make sure there are men who are coming in to speak and who are in the room as well, and kind of championing in that space. I don't think that the idea of isolated networks is so interesting to me, and I could spend all day on this, but I guess I'm curious to know from your perspective, how much do you think that the way in college athletics specifically, the way that the governing bodies kind of came to be, so moving from some of the earlier governing bodies into the one that really had legs, the AIAW, right before the NCAA takeover, how much do you think that really the separation of those 2 things where the NCAA was focused on men's sports exclusively and sponsoring men's championships, and the AIAW was responsible for sponsoring and promoting women's championships, and then the NCAA saw, "Oh, there's money, there's TV contracts actually for women's sports," and then kind of started this takeover, and I'm specific with that word because Charlotte West and Judy Sweet were very they called me out when I was like, "Oh, the merger," and they're like, "No, that was a takeover at best." So, how much do you think that kind of the way things set up in college athletics have impacted maybe some of the stagnancy or this kind of lag that we've seen for women to break past middle management and get into those upper echelon roles?
Yeah, and they're all everything is interconnected, right? And I lean into the institutional theory of research from this because you're right, a takeover. I'd like to say it originally wasn't designed for us or by us,
Yeah,
right? And we even know this before 1972, Title IX, that there were more women coaches of women's sports than there are today.
yeah,
Right? And we're 50 years past this. And why? Because, right, oh, I can monetize this now. I can make a great living off of this now. And so it came in, they came into it, right? Or the takeover has happened. Where I even see how it's housed with intercollegiate specifically, it's housed within higher education. So we have to even zoom out from that. Who's sitting in president seats? Who's sitting in vice chancellor seats? Who's the majority of faculty, the majority of the donors that are sitting on the board of trustees, board of governors, right? All of this does have something to do because who says, who's represented on these boards, right? Then who makes decisions to make these hires? And again, we're all still too comfortable with someone who looks just like ourselves. Okay. And so it has truly affected us today and still will. And so there's like, is there a complete redesign that needs to be done? And for what
yeah,
the future is going to look like? Because even if we think of when all these things were built, right? It was a very different time of amateurism than where we are today. Did anyone have the foresight of what even the sport industry altogether would become?
yep,
No, I think we all would have made a lot more investments in certain things,
right.
right? But it's been long overdue for what does a redesign look like?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think one that a lot of especially in college athletics, that's what a lot of people are thinking about right now because of the shift from, it's amateur status, amateur status, and then very suddenly the states now are saying, "Actually, no, let's you can pay the athletes in our states," and that's obviously kind of forced the hand and made some major changes, but this move from a real focus on education and amateurism into now almost a strictly business, minor league kind of setup, but with higher education markers that you still have to hit. It's a bananas time in college athletics, as you well know.
It is, and I also say, but chaos can also bring opportunity,
Sure.
right? And so, are we taking that opportunity to really design it? I'm not in all those seats or on those conversations. My curiosity is there, to say like what hasn't worked and what could work, but who's going to take those leaps? Who's going to sometimes say the no? And that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, this kind of perfect storm of COVID and NIL and now revenue sharing and all these pieces will be like 5 years down the road to see where we're at is gonna be interesting because I think we finally hit a point where this is the way we've always done it no longer works because the model is not applicable anymore. What's happening is not what's always been happening. So it's, crazy times.
Yeah, we'll come back in 5 years.
That's
Schedule
right.
it.
That's
Schedule us
right.
now.
That's right. You touched on this a little bit, but you also have work that focuses on servant leadership and developing ethical climates within sport organizations, which is so, so interesting. What drew you to that work specifically?
Yeah. Leadership has been a salient endeavor when we study research. And why has it been studied for hundreds of years, right? Is because we all still kind of try to emulate this leader. And even when I teach this in our executive MBA class, I want to remind people that you are an individual. You're operating within a system. That system could be, let's just say it's the organization. That organization operates within a boarding, or an industry, right? But then we have society. Then we also have the political climate, the social climate, the cultural climate, the economical climate, all that affects, right? And then you also have the organizational life cycle. And so, can you ever truly emulate? No, because I don't have the same behaviors and the characteristics that you do, Taylor, right? And then our organizations are at different points, right? We're selling different products. Um, And so I've always been so curious about this, but like, we put up leaders on this pedestal. Okay? And what I loved, it was interesting at that time, I think Tony Dungy had really popularized servant leadership at that
Mm,
time. However, if we go back to the work, this is Greenleaf's work from the 70s, and it became really popular in the early 2000s. Even today, I mean, sometimes I think it's overpopularized because you're like, well, what does servant leadership mean to you? Because a lot of people refer to themselves when you ask them what their leadership style is. And I loved it. Did this work because I was specifically in sport for development, and that's where we use tool as a resource, right, to empower people. So let's say at that time I was working with the World Cup, the homeless World Cup,
mm,
right? So they'll work with homeless people. Yes, they actually get to go play all across the world, but think of that, someone who's homeless, they had to get access to their ID, their birth certificate, because they were getting a passport, right? But they also wanted to get the homelessness off the street,
right.
okay? And have them become the citizens again and integrate back into that lifestyle. And so you're using sport again as a tool. So it's sport
Mhm.
for development and peace. And so a lot of my research, we use that to contextualize servant leadership there. And so I think that contextualization is really important, even as anyone on their own leadership journey, is because that's a really tough question to answer. It's like, what is your leadership style? 'Cause I do say it's contextualized, or some people would say it's like a situational leadership, right? And even when we call this servant leadership, they're supposed to be known for serving their followers. But even if we use collegiate athletics, who are your followers? Are your followers the students? Are your followers alumni? Are your followers donors? And so it's really interesting. And again, I said that's why you have to kind of contextualize all of it and you could break down. But I think it's important that you are a combination of multiple styles and behaviors, right? But being very conscious where I do think we need more of this research when we talk about ethical climates right now, because I would love to see, I was able to serve on another student that studied toxic leadership, right? And it's fascinating to me because it's not studied enough. And particularly in sport, it hasn't, like, it's almost untouched. And that we need to see that. And we need to really see this sense of fear based leadership that's coming out, because it is causing people to act, right? And so you're seeing these results from it. But I'm like, what are the long term? Do those have long term consequences and short term gains? I don't know yet, you know, but where do we stand morally and ethically? And I think more research needs to be done in that. But again, we really contextualize it to the sport for development. And in that space, that does have to, because you're serving very vulnerable populations. And so those are your followers who you want to develop. You're leading with a sense of humility. And sometimes that might be harder in different contexts or organizations, but it was a beautiful leadership style and behavior to use in the sport for development context.
I have so many follow-up questions. I'm gonna try to remember all of them. The 2 that are standing out to me, it's the fear-based leadership, which I think we're seeing a lot of on a outside of sport and on a grander scale right now in the world. But I think in sport that historically has been like I don't wanna say you're like afraid of your coaches, but I think we have seen a shift generationally from having kind of just an understanding of hierarchical respect and authority, and we've moved away from that now. Social media, I think, has certainly played a factor. Cancel culture, add in, I think, whatever you want. But I'm curious to know if there is research you point to, or insights you draw from in in research that have to do with either fear-based leadership or with some of these generational changes.
So right now, the latest research has been on this idea of followership. So
Mm,
before becoming a leader, what does followership mean? What does that look like? And it's interesting because we're calling it, yes, I know we've called it in this case, this fear-based leadership. It hasn't been termed this, but I'm curious, like what's going to be the output from it? And we can say this in collegiate athletics. Look what did happen. Yes, when there was, let's say, an abusive coach, right? Now I do have an outlet. Because that's no longer just staying within our organization or with that coach and that administrator. I have my own platform,
yep.
right? There's a lot more protections now that are involved, rightfully so, but then there's also a lot of other opportunities, right? If I go back to when I played in the 90s, I could transfer, then I had to sit out. You could only
Mhm.
transfer once, right? That now has changed, right? Look at their transfer portal. So the conditions have changed as well. And so the fear based leadership, we could really say when there are limited opportunities, it can work well. So again, it's contextualized, right? But now, our example of an abusive coach, I have many opportunities I can go to, right? But if I didn't, I only had this one, I might have sat in my place and did exactly what I was told. When you have opportunities, that's not necessarily the case. or when you're
Right.
empowered, right? And you have access to other opportunities, that has changed. But I will say the followership research has been the latest. And I don't know. And this is why this is the call, right? We answer one research question and we need many more to see what this fear based leadership, and not just, I know we say coach athlete relationship, but also in the workplace, because there has been, even during COVID, there was an awakening, right? Like, no, I don't need to be working 90 or 100 hours and being paid peanuts, because again, I had more options. I had
Yep.
adjacent opportunity. I didn't just have to go work for a sport property or a collegiate athletic department. There's many sport adjacents. And so you did see the talent, shift in that
Mhm.
direction. And so I think it just brings ample opportunity to see, but do we need to see, is this fear based in properties on the business side, right? Of saying, well, there's only how many CMOs in the NHL, right? If
Right.
I were to use that, may I not get a position if I don't do this?
Mhm.
So I'm curious, not just from a coach athlete, but from an employee supervisor standpoint, what has been there. So researchers, curiosity, come on, if you want to study this, like, let's go, let's do something, let's find that next opportunity. But I'm
Absolutely.
really curious, and then especially you add the political climate and the economical climate. So when you're worried
Mhm.
there aren't jobs,
Right.
what does that do to our own psyche?
Yep.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, the opportunity and that feeling of empowerment is so interesting to consider in terms of followership, because how do you get to the point where you are operating in fear instead of maybe with your values or whatever it is? I think the other thing I wanted to follow up on was this idea of toxic leadership. I think a lot of the way that we hear it in today's world is toxic positivity. Maybe not as much right now, but I think the last however long was of you're living in la la land and it's you should be grateful for this, we should all be happy, even though it's terrible working environment, whatever it is, right? I think toxic positivity is probably the most popularized mainstream phrase.
Mhm.
How does toxic leadership, like what else does that encapsulate instead
Mhm.
of just because presumably it's not just toxic positivity, that there's more to
Right.
it than just that.
Yes, yes, and so many, like, sometimes micromanagers, that can be considered
Mm,
toxic, right? This burnout culture is a toxic environment. So there is a big umbrella, in the management literature, not so much in the sport, because I was on this dissertation for industrial organizational psychologist, Dr. Gray, who came out. And in her work, yes, she was looking at unhelpful support, where saying it was similar to a micromanager, but sometimes giving confusing directions. But it
mm,
creates this, and then you have multiple lines of leaders that you wait, one person says A and then you say B. So you're creating this environment, also abusive, whether that's emotionally, physically abusive leadership, all fit under this umbrella of the toxic leadership, how they create this environment.
interesting.
Oh,
Really
very.
interesting. Again, we could spend all day talking about this, but I know you're very busy, so we'll keep it moving. For another one of the ways that we crossed over, of course, is your work with Wells Quest, which I was familiar with when I was working at the University of South Florida because you did stuff with our department as well. But when I went to Game Plan is really, I would say, when that kind of took off and we got to partner together to create some education, some online curriculum for athletic staff members. The whole kind of idea of Wells Quest is aimed at creating better workforces and workplaces. What drew you to want to start that in the first place?
Yeah, two things. I use this term "pracademic" before, and what I realized, because yes, I had worked about 7 years before going back to get my doctorate, and I'm married to an administrator, so we have many, like, in practice. How does this work?
Hmm.
And so I always wanted to share that, right? Which was great. Having the opportunity to come to USF allowed me that opportunity to go into the workplace, and start doing some of that consulting, But then I realized the second, having a great mentor again, like Dr. Sutton, he's like, you need to start your own business as
Hmm.
well, because there's ample opportunity. But the second main point was we're preparing all of our students. Then I realized some of these organizations, even 100-year-old sport organizations, were still operating like mom and pops. And so I was failing our students once they were placed, because sometimes you're the best salesperson as an individual contributor was just promoted to be a leader, but not given any tools. And that's not their fault, like the organization's
Yep.
responsibility. Okay, how did
Right.
you were a great salesperson, but now you've got to manage people. You've actually got to empower and lead people, right? But yet they've never been given these tools. And so I'll go back to even 2017 with the Lightning, we started to do that. We created new people leader training. What did their onboarding look like? What did their onboarding look like when you did get promoted? into this leadership because leadership, you're in the human capital business, right?
Mhm.
So while I might have been the doer and all these tasks I got done, well, now I have 4 people working under me, right? There's instead of individual conflict, there's team conflict that I now have to help them navigate, right? And that does take a lot of time. Even as integrated as I said, what are everyone's leadership styles? Everyone's motivations are different. And so that was probably the second and the biggest was that I was failing my students
Mm.
because I had a great experience here and they're like, you didn't prepare us for the workforce. Yeah.
Which there's so many things, like, some of that stuff is just stuff that you have to learn by being in it, but I think to your point, the better we can prepare our students to move from essentially practicing academics into practicing professionals and kind of telling, like, we don't know what we don't know when we move from graduate assistant or undergraduate into that first role, and so I
Yeah.
think even having the awareness to ask certain questions, like, the better the questions are that you ask, the more prepared you're gonna be, the better answers I think you're gonna get.
Yeah. I also think sport has excused itself because there's like a constant revolving door. We just like talent just moves and that develops them. And that's not true.
Yeah.
Just because you worked here for 2 years and then there for two, that 4 years of experience or management doesn't happen. But if you look at some large corporations, do have learning and development is a part from day one. And sport organizations, we have to step up. It is our responsibility as organizations to develop our talent, not just, prepare 'em for the next job.
It will be interesting to see. Particularly, professional sports have kinda had, obviously, a business model that they're operating off of for some time now, but I think in college athletics, it'll be interesting to see the more we shift toward this business model because, obviously, corporations are doing it, right? They are promoting people within, they are keeping folks at their corporations for longer periods of time than a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is. So it'll be interesting to see if the turnover rate stays as high as they shift as the business model shift kinda happens. Be
Yeah, and
interesting to
we've
see.
always excused it, but we truly don't. I know Lizzie Taylor, Matt Hummel have like started to look at the turnover rate,
Yeah,
but what explains it? And we just excuse it. Oh, that's just sport. But is it? Does it need to be that way? Does it have to be that way? We'd actually
yeah.
save a lot more money if we developed our talent and promoted within. Mm.
I was just listening to a clip of Matt Hummel, I don't know what podcast it was he was on, but sharing some of those turnover rates, and it is when you if you're in it, generally, each institution that I have worked at in college athletics, there's people all over the country now who at one time, we were all at the same school, and now everybody's kind of all over the place, like that you move out to be able to move up. But I don't think it's been talked about as they're doing now, kind of, in broad daylight, and let's put some numbers with this and show how really truly crazy these turnover rates are and how quickly things are happening. So aside from turnover rates, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing sport organizations facing today?
First would be embracing change,
Mm,
whether that's AI, whether that's policy, right? We've got to be some nimble and we've got to be willing to, okay, where's the opportunity to grow? Where's the opportunity to learn? Here's how we can be better. Another thing is upskilling and reskilling our employees, right?
mhm,
Would be a big thing. I also say emotional intelligence. It's interesting. We just finished, we'll have to come back because we have a book about emotional intelligence in action. It's like a 66-day journal because a lot of people say they're emotionally intelligent, like, "Oh, yeah, I'm very self-aware." Well, that's one of the 4 quadrants, right? You also have to self-regulate. You have to
mhm,
have a social awareness and a social regulation, and so and it can be taught. These are things that can be taught and skilled, and so that's a really big challenge, because a lot of people, regardless of what seat, some of the highest executives will say they're highly, and I'm like, no, you have self-awareness, but your lack of regulation is very low,
mhm.
if even existent. And then the competence matching the confidence. I would say, especially in sport, there's just sometimes this bravado, and you kind of just you have it, but the competence has to be there as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Again, we could spend all day talking about that, but for the sake of time, let's move into kind of the final few pieces here. Do
Yeah.
you have any final advice, on how we can continue creating inclusive workspaces in sports?
Yeah. Well, I love it. As we talked about servant leadership, actually, Dr. Taylor and I in a working group, have been working on inclusive leadership.
Mm,
And so we're getting ready to, been talking with collegiate administrators, right? Like, what does this mean? How do we enact this? And what's this meaning of this inclusive leadership? I think the biggest thing is inviting folks. We can't just say, I have an open door. Have I invited you in? Have I invited the conversation? Have I shared things about my own growth and development? Like we say, the sense of vulnerability, right? Am I present? Do I show a grounding technique or mindfulness like, oh, I'm really busy. I'm overwhelmed right now. Like, do I share that
Hmm.
with others? Because I don't have it all together. I'm a mother of three. I'm working. I have a consulting business. I'm an educator. I'm a sister. I'm an aunt. I'm a friend, right? And every day I disappoint someone. And I have to know that, okay, life is to me, yes, we say there's balance, there's new words like integration. I say every day for me, it's a negotiation because there's days I might have to tell my youngest, no, we can't do that. And I'll get some tears, right? But I'm like, hey, but tomorrow we're going to do A, B, and C. Right? Or this is mommy's priority today. Also, a big thing about inclusive leadership is recognizing really that rest for ourselves, it's not a reward. It is productive.
Hmm.
And being this inclusive leadership again shows you have to have this awareness of yourself, but you also have this awareness of everyone, right? And show people that here's the realities of life, right?
Yeah.
But that invitation is also inviting yourself to the table to showcase that with your employees, with your teammates, so that they can see the realities of it.
Yeah. I think what you just said made me think it's not just always about inclusivity, but advocacy, whether that is for yourself or for others and all of those things. I generationally, like, I'm thinking about your comment, like every day I'm disappointing someone. My mom mentions there was a commercial and I can't remember if it was for something like perfume or a household object or something, but it was like, you can wake up and make breakfast for the family in the morning, and then you can go to work, and then you can do this, and you can use this perfume, and you really can do it all. Like, this idea of women should be able to do all the things, which I think, again, the Barbie movie really, really called out. But that idea of being able to do it all, and then also not being able to pour from an empty cup, as they say, is huge in leadership, as we know.
Absolutely.
If you could get some hang time with any woman in sports, who would it be and why?
Well, I'm a social butterfly. So my hang time is going to be a call to a table with generations, right?
I
Because
like it.
I think sometimes it gets lost. If I'm just with one person, I'm like, oh, but I want my niece to know this or my son to know this, but I want to learn from them. I'm going to
Mhm.
stick with my volleyball roots. I love the time being mentored, and sometimes you don't even realize you're silent mentors. But then I had the opportunity to work, even Cecile Renaud, just one of the godmothers of volleyball, that even helped create We Coach. I remember the infancy stages as that was going to happen. Gabrielle Reese would be one to see it from the player side. So I want this table of generations, but I also want the representation of the athlete, of the coach, of the business executive, and the educator, and the next generation. Because sometimes things get lost. And like today, we're still fighting battles that 50 years ago we were. And yet, if we had all those lessons, right, and I could just pick that brain a little bit longer and share it would be great. And then, like, let's have an executive, from League One Volleyball that's there. Like, I think Katie on that is with the CEO there. And then one of my nieces at the table so that we could share that and we could learn from and with one another. But again, not just from the athlete standpoint, not just from the coach's standpoint. There's
Mhm.
so many synergies and opportunities that we miss, but how could we share them and just possibly doing better because we're still paving some of the same path that
Yep.
that 50 years ago was starting to be paved.
Yep.
So I would love a hang time with a generation of women.
I like it. That's a first for the podcast, that it's a hang time of a table of women. I like it.
Yeah.
Like it. Okay, where can listeners get involved? Where can they support or follow you, follow the Vinnick program, follow Wells Quest? Where can they do
Yes.
that?
Yes. And thank you for that. First, yeah, if you have interest in coming to grad school, our program, USF, go to the website. You could even just put in Vinnick, Sport and Entertainment Management. Find that. Again, you'd work 3 days a week and then take classes 2 days, earning your MBA. And working, we say Tampa is our classroom. For Wells Quest, we really focus on mid-level or emerging leaders, right? That's for you to decide and to find, right? Because we're all on our own journeys, you like to say. But our biggest thing there, so we're on Instagram, would be Wells Quest, and then LinkedIn. But the biggest thing that we're starting is essentially this community, and it's really called the Middle Power Collective, where we want to create a community of mid-level leaders because they're so busy. We're so busy managing up, managing across, and managing down. And so starting in August, we're going to now meet on the first and third Fridays at 12 o'clock Eastern. So if you want that, you can email me or on Wells Quest on Instagram or LinkedIn. We can share more about that. But it's just a space, again, we saw a need, right?
Mhm.
In the talent development. And if these organizations aren't going to create it, then we're going to help create it in the community and show up for each other. So it's yes, it's majority of folks in sports, but other industries are represented, and so creating that community.
I like it. Well, Dr. Wells, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join me today and talk about all the things we just hit on.
Thank you again, Dr. Onion.
You bet. All right, listeners, we will see you back in a couple of weeks. Until then, you can follow along at HangTimeP0D on Instagram, TikTok, and X. We will see you next time.